Okay, you're on.
Good morning, Westminster. Get your cup of coffee and curl up to the television and have a good show with us. And good morning, Carol, and good morning, Boyd.
Good morning, Boyd.
Hi, Carol. Hi, Ken. How are you?
We're good. And
Good.
we want to welcome a very special guest this morning, Paul Lehman, who is with us to talk about his travels and his slides. And we're going to get to him in just a few minutes.
Excuse me, Carol.
Oh, what, Boyd?
Not another poem, I hope.
Ken, just leave him alone. I'm anxious to hear your poem, Boyd. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. I do have a poem.
Are we going to do one of these every week?
Stop
Well,
that.
we'll see. But this one is another haiku. It's a travel haiku.
Oh,
All right. The title is Airline Passenger with Tuna Sandwich. And here's the poem. Tuna on a plane. Worse than snakes, I ask myself, what would Jesus do? I'll give that another reading. I don't like it. Tuna on a plane. Worse than snakes. I ask myself, what would Jesus do? All right.
Boyd,
Maybe if I read it 3 times, it'll be funny. I don't know.
no.
It's funny now.
I think high school is a little over my head, but it reminds me the little story about the pastor who was giving a children's sermon, the little kids around him at the altar. And he said, okay, kids, what's brown and furry and runs around in trees? Nobody said anything. And he said, come on. And so one of them said, I know the right answer is always Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me.
Sounds like a squirrel to me.
That's where I
That's
am
funny.
with haiku, I think.
Okay.
But
All
Well,
right.
I think, Boyd, if you're ready, I think we ought to I'm assuming that Paul is still with us. He endured this and he's ready to tell us his story. Paul?
Still here.
Paul, tell us about your very first trip. How you decided to go there, and did you go with the idea of taking slides and really making a thing of it, or did that just kind of happen because there were a lot of photo ops?
We've never traveled with the intent of taking pictures to show to people. We take pictures for ourselves. We haven't given any presentations to audiences until I retired. But we like destinations where we can see wildlife and natural phenomena. And we like to go places where we can get a view of diverse cultures of the world and places that reflect the historic sites that reflect the progress of humanity through history.
Well, what you must have had some very long trips. What was the longest and farthest trip you made?
The longest land trip we have ever taken was our trip on the Silk Road. That's the route that connected China with Europe, and it was one of the most important trade routes in the world for 1,600 years, starting in the 2nd century BC. And incidentally, that's the subject of an article that is scheduled to appear in the fall edition of that popular publication, the Westminster Writers' Journal.
Thanks for that plug, Paul.
And I also like to mention the longest day we ever experienced. This occurred after a cruise along the Kamchatka Peninsula on the east coast of Russia. That's just in the North Pacific across from Alaska. We finished the cruise in Petropavlovsk, Russia, and we took a plane from there to Moscow. We left at 12:15, and in the afternoon. It was an 8.5-hour flight. They served lunch early in the flight, dinner late in the flight. We arrived in Moscow at 11:45. We arrived 30 minutes before we left Petropavlovsk. And the way we were able to do that is that much of that flight took us north of the Arctic Circle. And in those latitudes, the time zones were very narrow. So that's how we were able to arrive 30 minutes before we left after an 8-hour flight. Then 2 hours later, we left for New York. That was a 10-hour flight. Once again, they served us lunch early in the flight and dinner late in the flight. When we got in New York, it was only 2 hours after we left Moscow, even though we had flown
Wow.
for 10 hours. So, most days include only 24 hours. That's the normal pattern. But for us, that day was 44 hours long. We had crossed 20 time zones. It's the longest day we ever experienced.
Oh
Was
my
it-
goodness,
Wow,
wow.
that's incredible.
Well, I
Was
was
it-
wondering if you had ever had any real trouble things happen, but that sounds like it went smoothly, but that just happened to be what the itinerary, how that fell was 45 days long or whatever, hours.
Was
We've
there,
never had any
excuse me,
we've never had any problems traveling, although there were a couple of occasions when Ruth was a little uncomfortable. We arrived in Kenya 2 days after some national elections that were seriously disputed. There were widespread charges of fraud and vote rigging, apparently well-founded. And that set off a wave of violence and rioting. There were some 1,100 people murdered in those couple of weeks, and 350,000 people displaced from their homes. But it didn't affect tourists, although in the Masai Mara Reserve where we were, Ruth woke me up in the night to say that she had heard gunfire nearby. I reminded her that it was New Year's Eve, but I don't think she went back to sleep. Our guide had assured us that these disturbances were ethnic based and wouldn't affect tourists, and of course he was right. There was another occasion in Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. We were in a mobile camp, which was just tents set up by our tour company in an area where they thought the wildlife would be abundant. And there were only 3 of us in this tour group. We were cared for by a staff of 7 there. Ruth was concerned because there was no protective fence around the camp. And she was afraid that any lion that wanted to get into our tent could easily do so. I assured her that couldn't happen. There was no danger because lions don't have opposable thumbs, so they couldn't unzip the flap at the front of the tent. But she didn't
Did that
seem
reassure
convinced.
her?
she
Phil,
bought that,
our
she
3
bought
nights
that
there were-
story, did she?
Excuse me?
So did you have trouble in the Maasai with the monkeys between the lodge and the dining room?
Well, our 3 nights there were uneventful. Once you get accustomed to the animals roaring and crying and braying in the distance, and there were monkeys scampering about on the top of our tent.
Yeah.
There was another place in Masai Mara where there was an outdoor dining facility, and there was a fellow there, colorfully dressed in a native costume. He had a slingshot, and it was his job to keep the monkeys away because they would dart up and steal your food if you weren't alert.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you decide on what camera equipment you want to take?
When we traveled by car, used to travel by car around the US and Canada, we had a zoom lens and a tripod. But when we began traveling overseas, we decided all that equipment wasn't worth the effort. So we just take a couple of small point and shoot cameras. That's the only equipment we use. We just figure that if we take enough pictures, some of them are bound to be good.
Oh, that's the way that's great.
Now, I've noticed in the slideshows that we have been to up at Harris Bell Hall, every picture just looks to me like perfect. And I know that a good photographer takes a lot of pictures of the same thing and picks out the best one. But how do you manage to not turn out with a picture with a garbage truck in it or a telephone pole or something like that?
Ruth is very good at cropping and editing pictures. She does that very well. She works magic on them. I've taken pictures that were so dark, I thought they were totally useless, but she can make them usable. And she's she's good at things like this. We've taken pictures of Roman ruins that have electric wires in them. Now, they're not supposed to be electric lines in Roman ruins, so she takes those out. They vanish magically.
You know, the first time I was ever in Rome was standing taking a picture of the ruins, and the Goodyear blimp turned out to be in the picture. And I hadn't even noticed that, so it kind of destroyed the, you know, the look of the ruins.
Well, Paul, I know, I mean, you have obviously encountered some very interesting people. How about some of the more memorable ones that you've encountered?
Well, whenever you find yourself in locations where they don't get very many English-speaking tourists, there are often young people who are studying English in school and they want to practice their English. And that can be a very interesting and rewarding experience. I remember also one location in China where there was a group of young girls that was staring at Ruth. And we found that they were staring at her because they had never seen a blonde person before. They were fascinated by her hair. And they wanted to reach out and touch it and see what it felt like. So that was fine with us. And I think that was rewarding for them. I think the most interesting conclusion we have come to as far as people are concerned is that everywhere we've gone, the people have been very friendly, very welcoming. The governments may have harsh words for one another, but the people are always friendly. We think particularly of Iran. We were there a few years ago, and the people of Iran were as friendly as anyone we have ever encountered. It seemed as though everyone we met in Iran had an uncle in Cleveland or a cousin in Dallas, but without exception, those people were enthusiastic and welcoming us to their country. And they asked us to tell our friends when we got home that Iran was a great place to visit.
That's good to hear. They went through a long period of westernization or modernization before the religious revolution. So they have a kinship, I think, to the West. Don't you believe? The Iranians, that is.
I think they do. Paul, can you hear that?
Yes, I hear you, Ken.
The Iranians have a Western inclination more than a lot of other Middle Eastern countries. They kind of pro-West.
During the Shah's regime, before the Shah fell, there was a lot of modernization and interest in Western ideas and culture. That was my point. I'm sorry, Paul's not picking me up. You all go ahead.
Paul?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay.
Paul, what's your favorite?
Intermittently.
Pardon me? What's your favorite trip that you and Ruth have taken, and what made it your favorite?
Oh, that's a tough question. Usually our favorite trip is the most recent, but we've especially liked trips in Africa, all over Africa. There's such diverse countries there. We like Central Asia. Ruth has a favorite trip, I think is distinctive. She particularly enjoyed our trip to Timbuktu. And what she liked there was the trip on the Niger River to get there. We spent 2 days on the Niger River. And we have done river cruises elsewhere, but this cruise was on just a tiny boat. It was more like a large canoe. It had a motor and they were partially covered. There were only 4 of us on this trip with a crew of 4. And that river is totally free of commercial traffic, almost no native traffic. Occasionally someone came by in a boat with a goat or a sheep. But at night we just pulled over on a deserted riverbank and they set up our tents and served a meal and we went to sleep. It was totally different from the luxury cruises we've encountered elsewhere.
Wow. Well, Paul, you know, one of the highlights, I think, for not only me, but many of the residents at Westminster were your slideshows and lectures on Africa and the other subjects that you lectured on. So assuming that we get over the COVID-19 sometime in the future, or do you have any other shows that you might could share with us?
Yes, when we were interrupted, we were in the middle of a series we call African Safari. There were 5 parts. We had done 4 presentations on Kenya, Tanzania, Botswana, and Namibia. And we have one more coming up. That'll be South Africa. We were also doing a series of the shows of Gilbert and Sullivan. We were
Right.
about a third of the way through that. The next one coming up will be Iolanthe. And we have presentations we'll be ready to present on Egypt and Jordan, and one on Brazil and Pantanal. That's a section of Brazil. It's the largest tropical wet.
I'm afraid we.
Wow. Well, Paul, do you have any, I know you said your last trip was about your favorite. Do you have anything pending in the way of trips, perhaps when the COVID is over?
Can you hear us, Paul? I don't know what's happened, but his picture's frozen.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Man, he's been all over the world. That's incredible.
he certainly has. He certainly has. Well,
Yeah, Paul,
thank
he
you,
really
Paul, for
enjoyed it.
being here today. And we're sorry to cut you off like that, but we'll blame AT&T or somebody.
You know, Boyd, when he was telling about some of those safaris and everything, Ken went to Africa year before last, and he called me the second day he was there, and he said, we had a stampede of elephants come by the camp
Well,
last
they
night.
weren't stampeding, but
Well, there are a lot
Yeah.
of them in. And I said, wow, how was that like? And he said, well, I was asleep. And I said, and how much are we paying for this trip?
Paul is back with us now. Paul, we lost you there for
Say
a
that
while.
again.
Yeah.
You're back with us, huh?
We just were hearing about Gilbert and Sullivan, I think, when we lost you. So, but
Well-
thank you for being with us today.
It's a
Yeah,
pleasure.
very
Glad,
interesting, Paul. Thank you very much.
glad to be with you.
Okay, Boyd, what else do we have going on?
Well, a lot. Tonight on channel 1890, I believe Betsy Bouchard will be the speaker on how to preserve a ranch. You know, she has a
Oh,
family ranch west of Austin, and she's been spending a lot of time out there. And I think she's going to share with us how the steps that she's taken to preserve or return the land to a more natural state. I'm looking forward to that.
That sounds good. And that's at 7?
Yes. And then there's on 1890, and then there's another mass resident contest going on. And so be sure and turn your ballots in. It's going to be hotly contested.
Hey, that's great. That's a good lineup. Anything else we need to know?
Well, Halloween is Saturday night, and according to the schedule, Marilyn Monroe will be in the Preston Courtyard at 6:30 on Friday night.
Now, I know it's Halloween and she died some time ago, so that sounds really spooky.
It
I
certainly
bet a bunch of
does.
guys are gonna go down and check it out anyway.
Well, she came to the solarium one time before. I don't know if that may have been before you moved here, but Marilyn was present, so she's back. So listening to Paul talk about all his travels, I was reminded of a time that Kitty and I were in the Crimea, and we were on a cruise, and we stopped at Yalta to go to the to tour, and they bussed us over to the Levadia Palace where the Yalta conference was held, and for a tour of the palace. And that was a palace that had been built by the Tsar and finally finished just not long before the revolution. And so when you get there, there's a huge, long paved entranceway, and there were tour buses from other ships, and there was a line that was 2 hours long to get into the palace to see where the conference was held. And Kitty, after a while, said, "I really need to go to the bathroom." And I said, "Can't you wait?" And she said, "No, I really need to go to the bathroom." And so I called our in-tourist guide over, and she came over, and I explained that my wife needed to go to the bathroom. And she said, "That's not possible." And I said, "Well, she really needs to make a trip to the bathroom." And she said, "She should have gone before you got here." And I said, "Well, you know, that was 2 hours ago, and we're going to be another 2 hours in this line." And I reached in my pocket, and I found that I had a $5 US bill that I had not turned in, which you're supposed to do in those days when you get off the ship. So I shook her hand and gave the guide the $5 bill, and she didn't say a word. She just took Kitty by the shoulder and marched her up to the palace and in one of the doors. And a little while, Kitty came back and she said, "Oh, you won't believe that. It was just wonderful. It was all marble and everything." Well, it turned out to be the Tsarina's bedroom, where Churchill had his resting quarters, and Roosevelt had been staying in the Tsar's bedroom or quarters, and he had a bathroom there. But it wasn't well known that the big issue at the Yalta Conference was not where the dividing line was going to be between Poland and Russia, or what the occupation zones were going to be. It was, how do you go to the bathroom? Because there were only 2 full baths in the palace, and there were 7 other baths, 9 altogether, and there were 2,000 people there. And so everybody was standing in line except Churchill and Roosevelt. Even Stalin was standing in line. So anyway, Kitty came back so happy that she had seen Churchill's bathroom. And this woman behind us had heard some of this conversation, and she called the guide over and said, "I need to go to the bathroom." And the guide said, "It is not possible."
Oh, what a great story. I bet she's gotten a lot of mileage.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Those were the days during the during Soviet rule that traveling in Russia was an adventure.
Well, fellas, we have another great guest coming up next week. That'll be Jill Losey, and she is going to remind us about the sending in your check for the Residents Appreciation Fund. It's going great guns, and we need everybody to fill up those candy canes.
And due to the generosity of Westminster residents, we're on our way to meeting our goals. And the Westminster employees really deserve your support.
Yes, I hope everybody will join in that drive. So that's about all the time we have today. Thanks again, Paul Lehman, for being here today, and all of you viewers out there. If you haven't filled out your survey, fill it out or send us an email. Tell us things you'd like for us to talk about, things you'd like, residents you'd like to have as guests. And be sure and tune in next Monday at 8:30 a.m. on channel 1890. And then above all, stay safe and stay well. Goodbye, Paul.
Bye,
Goodbye,
Paul.
Ken.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, Carol.
Goodbye.
Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
so much.
And a happy Halloween.